You guys know what I always do is I want to do a run-up to get us up to space again. So remember 1900, they get to 1900, and the Americans are perceiving that there are some problems in America. A lot of what was going on in America looked good. Economy very strong, of course, large corporation, technology, products, cities burgeoning, the nation that made it onto the world. But really everything sort of seemed troubling to the middle class. They felt that, of course, big business was beginning to emerge into horizontal integration, trusts and monopolies. The workers were tremendously unhappy, of course, and they were striking all the time. The cities were centers of chaos and confusion. There's a babble of tongues, a confusion of culture as far as the immigrants are concerned. And on top of all of it, it's just this extraordinary level of political corruption. So the general feeling of that moment is not one of euphoria and everything's hunky-dory and wonderful. The feeling is one of crisis. The Americans felt in a crisis. The middle class felt the crisis most keenly, but they will respond to it with this incredible reform movement, which we're beginning to get into right at this particular moment. They had this faith in progress. They had a faith in science. They were motivated to do good for America, but also to recreate America in the image of the middle class. These are all powerful kind of factors. And I also, of course, want you to be very aware of the fact that the new universities are appearing, that they're starting to crank out graduates who are told that they need to do something good for America. And all of that creates this impulse and impetus to really begin to reform and do what they can, of course, to transform America. As I told you, we see two manifestations of reform activities. First, just individuals who begin to really mobilize themselves. Heroic people like Jane Addams or Margaret Sanger, of course, doing what they can to uplift those that they felt it was needed for. And also the social gospel, I at least wanted to mention that, of course, the Salvation Army and friends that began to do their particular kind of thing, motivated by their evangelical Christianity, among other things. But one of the more exciting areas was the area of journalism. You have this dynamic era of the newspaper. They're expanding, they're innovating, they're highly competitive, of course, and so they're trying to figure out every way they can to sell newspapers. And that comes into kind of play with these journalists coming out of the universities who are trying to help America, and it emerges as this manifestation that we call the muckrakers. The muckrakers are America's first significant investigative journalists looking into the problems of America, presenting them to America with an intent and hope, of course, that they would begin to mobilize people to do something about it. And they actually do an incredible job when you think about it. So I want to give you some sense of what the muckrakers did. Many of them took on issues like big business, and Ida Tarbell is just one of the first to kind of mobilize in this area. She actually is preceded by a man who started kind of the dynamic of turning against the Standard Oil, and then she followed it up, and hers made a little bigger splash, and she wrote much more on it. She ultimately would become a book. But kind of showing everyone that Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller, they're robber barons. He was using manipulation, he was using unethical business practices, et cetera, et cetera. And the Rockefeller family never quite was the same. They had to kind of do damage control to fix that situation. I didn't tell you, I guess, about Frank Norris, and Frank Norris wrote a book called The Octopus. And The Octopus was this discussion of the Southern Pacific Railroad and the way that it had come to dominate California, both in the legislative process, the governing apparatus, and economically. And there's many stories there that I could tell you what the Southern Pacific Railroad did. And what it really did was horrify Californians, that they all of a sudden had this corporation that seemed to have its arms around everything, of course, squeezing the lifeblood out of the state of California. And there's an impact here. Californians turned against it. The government could no longer kind of function within the corruption of the corporation. And although the Southern Pacific will remain in California, it's not going to be the same power that it was before. Things are going to be diminished as a result of that. One of the greatest of the muckrakers, in fact, the greatest, also took on big business. His name was Upton Sinclair, and of course he took on the meatpacking industry, and he wrote a book called, anyone know? It's called The Jungle, and The Jungle becomes the most famous of all the muckraker works, and so famous that I'm going to present it to you in context, and it becomes its own particular identification. So that becomes a different story, right? Another area which the muckrakers went after was the area of political corruption. There's a lot of, this is just a huge activity of this time, and so there were many who simply stepped forward to try to do the expose in this particular area. One of the most famous was a man by the name of Lincoln Steffens. S-T-E-F-F-E-N-S. Lincoln Steffens was famous for writing articles that began with "the shame of." The shame of. So it would be the shame of the cities, all the corruption of the cities, the shame of the Senate, or something like that. Political corruption one place or another, trying to really just expose that problem, of course, and really motivate, they hope, some moving away from it and reform one way or the other. During this time, you have a lot of sort of political cartoons that are of the same ilk. And just because this gives me a chance to draw on the board, and that's what I wanted to do when I was a kid, I wanted to draw on the board. I just want to show you the kind of way that they would portray politicians in the political cartoons. And I can do it because it's really simple. So you just start with your head, of course, you know, and almost all of them would be wearing a tall top hat and stuff like that. And then, of course, you've got the collar like that. You can do the eyes and the face if you want to. And then they have the tie around here. But the bodies were always made like this, okay? And they would always go like this on them. So these guys are just a bunch of money bags, right? They're in it for the money one way or the other. Isn't that an incredible reproduction of this political caricature? I think it's just amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you. Hold down the applause, please. Anyway, but this is the kind of thing you would come to see routinely. So a lot of expose of political corruption. Another area which they began to look into was the area of labor. And there's a lot of labor issues that were simply there for expose. One thing that they focused on was child labor. Of course, significant abuses here, and I want to tell you more about the kind of things they did responding to child labor. One of the more interesting tracks that came out of the Muckrakers, and I really feel bad about not remembering her name, but I simply do not, forgive me, okay? But it was a young muckraker, and she decided to find out what it was like to be a woman working in the factories of New England. So she, classic investigative reporting. She went to a secondhand clothes store, got herself the working woman's clothing kind of stuff, goes down, gets employment, works in there for a month, comes out and writes about her experiences, and it was just kind of an amazing thing. The factory she went into, this was something that emerged in the 19th century into New England. And I have to tell you, it's kind of a collaboration between the factories and the parents of these young women. So you kind of have to blame their mom and dad, too. It's not just the factory that did this. So the parents wanted their daughters to work to create a supplemental income for the family, but they didn't want their daughters to be free in the city, in the factories, and all that kind of stuff. So they created these factories that were a factory with a dormitory. And in many ways, the image that you kind of get, it's like a prison sort of, okay? So you have to spend all this time in the dormitory, of course, you have curfew, et cetera, and most of your day, of course, spent in the factory. And my sense is that all they could do is go to the factory and back and forth kind of thing, so the control of their lives. And that became part of the story. She just wanted, these women are kind of unhappy, they're kind of in a controlled environment, there's very little freedom, et cetera, et cetera. But the big expose was the sexual abuse that was taking place in these factories. It's all the employees are young women. All of the foremen are men, okay? All the foremen are men, and it's just kind of tailor-made for the potential of abuse. And the kind of thing she said when she just discovered when she's there, that in the women's bathrooms, they took off all the doors on the stalls. And the company said they did it because they didn't want anyone smoking or wasting time or lollygagging in there, but the reality was that these foremen wanted to get a peep show if they could possibly get it. And the end game was that the women would not go to the bathroom in the factory. And can you imagine them spending this incredibly long day, often a 10-hour-plus day, and just trying to hold it? And I've done that a few times, and you just know that there becomes a point of agony in many ways, right? And I think of them running back, back to the dormitory at the end of the day just to relieve themselves from whatever they could. This is the kind of story I shouldn't tell you, but I remember when coming home from school, I hadn't gone to the bathroom, sprinting down the street. The only problem is it kind of inhibits you to move fast. And I just couldn't make it. I decided I did not want to pee my pants. So I think I was like 6, and I just peed on a palm tree right in the middle of the street. I always thought, am I going to get in trouble for this or not? And of course, if anyone saw me, they didn't say anything about it. I can sympathize with their agony. This is the kind of thing I should not be telling you guys, especially when we're recording. Sorry. Anyway, but expose, the saddest story of this entire era. You guys heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that occurred in New York City, and it's just this is the kind of thing they would all this time they had to tell the story of something that really happened. But this was a factory, a textile factory. It was located, I think, on like the 9th and 10th floor of a building in New York City. And there were fire escapes, but they were old and rickety, basically. There were exit doors, but the company locked the doors because they didn't want the women to go out there and go smoking and stuff like that. There was an elevator that went up and down, but you guys all know that you cannot take that many people in an elevator to get them out of there. But one day, probably a cigarette or something like that just fell into the pile of this. If you look at the pictures, the place is just filled with fabric. It's fabric everywhere, okay? And lots of like the little pieces that have been cut off or whatever, and they're just sitting there on the floor. And you can imagine a cigarette ash or something like that hitting it. A conflagration of the fire begins to start, of course. Everyone's just panicking. They get onto the fire escape. Of course, ultimately the fire escape begins to collapse underneath them. They had a guy that worked the elevator, and he was relatively heroic, and he just tried to keep going up and down, and but at some point the fire simply just jammed the mechanism and wouldn't work. The women were just stacked up against the doors they would find later. They're just trying to, and of course they're locked, and they don't allow them to get out in that particular kind of way. And the horror of the whole story was that they simply, as the fires, those that weren't burned inside, they simply came out on the edges and on the ledges there in the windows. We're talking, 9, 10 stories up, okay? And, it became that point where it's either, go into the fire or jump. And they started to jump. And, they talk about the people standing on the ground just listening to the thumps. Thud, thud, thud. And then they began to jump in groups because they were trying to give each other strength in it. And they would actually be holding hands as they step off. We have pictures of them taking the step off where they're holding hands with each other to try to gain some kind of strength to face what's going on. And then they, later on, they just laid all the bodies there of the girls who, they were all young women between the ages of like 14 and 24. A lot of them were Jewish immigrants. And this is the kind of thing that was happening, of course, the lack of safety. And this is the kind of thing that the muckrakers were dedicated. If you ever see a really good documentary on that, you cannot finish that one without tears in your eyes. It was just a horrible thing that happened to these poor women. This is the kind of thing they wanted to expose. Child labor issues, of course, women's labor issues, etc. These are things that they would write about. There's a couple of them that took on the issues of race, and to me the sad part is that there were not more that did this, and one of the great heroic figures of the moment was a woman by the name of Ida B. Wells. She was very uncommonly a black woman muckraker who was trying to expose the evils of lynching. She started in Mississippi, but she had to leave because, of course, she was threatened with lynching if she would stay in that area. But she just created this crusade to try to let the nation know of lynching. I'll tell you much more about that later, okay, because maybe you don't know what that is right now. It was a horror, just a scourge upon America at that particular moment. And tragically, of course, little outcome of this, or little response to any kind of it. But I want you to know that there's a bunch of people looking at various things. The last one last area of interest was poverty. There were those who began to kind of address the issue of poverty in ways that had never been addressed before. And the hero of the story from the muckraker point of view was this guy named Jacob Riis. It's R-I-I-S, Riis. He was actually from Holland. He was Dutch, but he was university educated, and he was a journalist. And he came to America to try to work in America. The problem was that he couldn't speak English in the very beginning. And actually it became like this incredible learning experience. He lived in the slum of the slums of New York City. They called it 5 Points. And it was just this really harsh place, where the poorest of the poor would go. And as an academic, he kind of treated it like a learning experience. What am I seeing? What am I living in? And when he finally learned how to speak English, got a job, he decided to write about it. And he writes these articles that became, again, a book. And the book was called How the Other Half Lives. This book is considered to be, the first significant analysis of the poor in America. And he simply wanted in detail to let the people know, what it was like to be poor. And the one thing he did that made his work, it went from being kind of like something of interest to kind of a sensation, was he decided to use photography. He used pictures. So that meant that he went down into the inner city of New York City and he just started taking pictures of the things that he could see there. Photography is still kind of young, even at the beginning of the 20th century. You guys probably know that they started out like 1830, daguerreotypes and tintypes and stuff like that. Very much of a controlled environment problem because you have to, took difficulties with the development and all that kind of stuff. Almost all pictures were studio pictures. Of course, portraiture was the very beginning of this whole kind of thing. And they couldn't let you smile because, of course, they had to have long exposures. They had to maintain whatever look you have on your face that, where you do not show a smile. That's the way you guys almost always look at me, so I see it all the time. Even when I'm trying to tell a joke, it's the same look. It's pretty harsh. What can I say? Anyway, just kidding. But these are components of this. The idea of taking the camera in the field was relatively new, but that takes place like in the Civil War. Matthew Brady was famous for this, of course. You guys know that you could not take pictures of action because they couldn't do that, right? It'd be just a bunch of blurs or something like that. They do a few of those actually, and you get that kind of has a kind of look of action. It's a way. But the thing he found that he could photograph all the time were dead bodies. This is a powerful, evocative thing to photograph. The good news was he created, of course, these really compelling pictures of the war itself. The bad news was he messed with it a lot. He moved the bodies where he wanted them to go. So, that's something we find out later. And that's a little bit troubling, right? That's not what news photography is supposed to be. It's supposed to manipulate the scene in a kind of way. But if you have any sense of his situation, he's taking the big cameras out there, right? And right next to him is a huge wagon so he can go and develop it right out. I mean, it's all really complicated and difficult. By the beginning of the 20th century, you actually were beginning to take cameras in the field a little bit more easily, but still significant limitations in many ways. But this is what Riis decided to do. So he takes pictures of drunks sprawled off across the floor of the bar. He takes pictures of drunken women in the jails and stuff like that in the wintertime. Or those that took pictures of little kids, of course, wearing rags in various locations. One picture that he took, he wanted to show how the little kids, the street urchins, would go spend the night, and they would lump together like in a pile of kids on the grates that were on the sidewalk where the steam would come from the boilers underneath, so it's like a little bit of a source of heat on cold nights, and they would just do this. And he couldn't get a picture of them actually doing it because he'd be like sneaking up at night, right? And then they'd just run if he tried to do that. So the only way he could do this, of course, it's also like a technological thing, he could do it in broad daylight much easier. So he would pay them to show what they had done. He had to pay them money to do it. And so the pictures are kind of funky because the kids are huddled over the grate in broad daylight. You can see the shadow for the kids or something like that. And of course he tells them to look like they're asleep, so they're all clenching their eyes. It's not a relaxed look in the eyes, they're clenched. And so it gives it away, but it still tells the story one way or the other. One picture that he took that I'll never forget, it's like a room that's the size of the corner of our classroom right over here, and there are 10 guys sleeping in this little corner of this little teeny room. And he actually did try to take night pictures, so he used the flash pans. You guys familiar with the flash pan, flash photography? Open your lens, and then you have a flash just with like powder, the kind of, I don't know what it is, gunpowder, something like flash powder, and you would ignite that, and of course it would create this momentary illumination, equivalent of flash, and hopefully you got the shot or something like that. The picture really tells you the way that the picture was taken, because most of the guys are asleep, but one guy's he's waking up to see, he's terrified, right? I'm sure all he could see was, oh my God, what's happening? This kind of thing. Apparently Jacob Riis caught his hair on fire twice, that's the part I think. It's funny, I cannot help myself but make that comment, right? Because caught his hair on fire. Lighting up the pan right next to you. Anyway, all of the muckrakers, Jacob Riis is doing this, he's trying to let people know what it's like, of course, what's going on in America, and their intent was to raise the consciousness level of America, and to say that they were successful is a gross understatement. I mean, people were horrified, and they were amazed by what was going on, and you see the muckrakers as this massive stimulus for people to get off their butts and want to do something about the situation, and it really begins to explode kind of the reform activity in a major way. In the end, the reality is that the individuals did their thing, and that's good. But everyone kind of knew that they could not do enough by themselves. Whatever Jane Addams did, if it was 2,000 people a day, that's amazing, right? But that's not enough. There's so much more of a problem. So the progressives began to realize that what they had to do was use the government as the tool of reform. The government is the apparatus of reform. The government should represent us, right? You all know that that's the way it should be, and it should represent the majoritarian sentiment. And if the majority wants to use their government as a tool of reform, that's exactly what should happen, and that's exactly what they did. Okay, so they turned to use the government to become the agency of reform and do the things they wanted to do. Now there is kind of a process here that I want you to be aware of. They start at the local level and they work their way up in terms of using the governing apparatus. So what that means is the progressives started in the cities, and of course they would do this. And the reason they did this was the cities were where they lived and where the problems were very apparent. They start in the cities, and then they begin to move up. And they're going to run into obstacles, I'll tell you about that. Then they're going to move to the states, and then run into obstacles, I'll tell you about that. And then they move to the federal government. It's the ultimate expression, of course, of government. But all levels of government become part of the progressive process. Yes?
Do they look at the muckrakers as heroes, the people in society?
A lot of the establishment did not saw them as problems, right? But I think most of the middle class saw them as trying to be helpful, trying to expose the problems. In the same way that when I see investigative journalists, I generally feel that same way about them, that they are trying to make things better, right, by showing us the... one thing, just your point, I was thinking, today we have this all the time, but we're not really amazed by it, right, because it just happens all the time. So 60 Minutes is not like anything shocking to anybody, right? They got to come up with a really powerful expose. But no one had ever done this before, so that people were really shocked. They had never seen this kind of stuff before. So it was kind of amazing to them.
Well, my thought while you were telling the story is Project Veritas. Would you consider that a muckraker or muckraker?
Wow. That has that weird kind of thing that it is important. It's like our government should be transparent.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I despise the most about our government is that it does a lot of things, especially beyond the boundaries of the United States, that are really not good from my point of view. I believe in the Constitution. I believe that there should be no cruel and unusual punishment. I believe that torture is outlawed as a behavior of the United States of America. So anything that would show us that that is happening, I think that's important for us to know that that could be happening, and we should be able to respond against that. But also, of course, there is the issue of national security in a problematic world. So These are the kind of things that I think I more want to know than want to be kept in the dark, though. So maybe, but y'all, it's weird. You know, it's not so simple. And that's the problem with everything. They're so complicated, right? And everyone wants a simple kind of answer to anything. It's not. You know, so for almost everything, like even immigration, I mean, I feel both ways on that all the time. You know, I'm worried about everyone coming here, of course, and I'm worried about bad people coming here. But I also see that it's really beneficial in many ways. You know, you know, everything's just so complicated. So why are you bugging me about it? Come on. I don't know. Okay, here we go. See, I got that on tape. I'm not afraid to admit that. If there was a confused party of America, I would be the leader of it. Okay? I'm so confused I can't say. Okay, so the progressives decide they're going to use the governing apparatus, and they mobilize themselves to do that, and they start in the city. And they start in the city because that's where they live, right? And they see the things happening every single day. So it's the closest to you, so this is where you should begin to start. And anyway, they're going to use the governing apparatus. So what is the first thing you must do to begin to use the city as your tool of reform? What did they have to do right away?
Get rid of the bosses?
Okay, but yes. But what's the first thing you've got to do? If you want the city to work for you, what have you got to do? Okay, but you have to elect people. You may not necessarily have to be elected yourself, but you have to elect progressives, okay? Yesterday, the students said vote, and that's true, right? That's the act, but the vote, what's the outcome of the vote? You want to elect people who believe the way you do. And the progressives begin to vote, and so what do? They start voting for progressive mayors. These guys are openly progressive mayors, of course, or progressive aldermen, or progressive council members, whatever they call themselves. You know, the officials of the cities, those people who are elected, the progressives run. And they win, I should say that, and they win. And they win because the progressives are the majority of the population. And I love to tell you this part of it. When the progressives mobilize, it is bipartisan. It doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican. It seemed to only matter that they were the middle class. And they all had this objective of trying to change things for the better. And so they said, let's elect progressive candidates. And they did. You know, because they're the majority, they can do what they want to. So that means they took over the cities with progressive mayors and progressive members of the city council or whatever it was, right? And as soon as they did so, and they do it relatively quickly, they began to act. The whole idea was to use the government as the tool of reform. So here's what they did. Here's the first thing. They began to do everything they could to clean up government. One thing that was incredibly troubling to the progressives was what a terrible state the cities were in and how poorly run they were. You guys all know it's pretty much the result of the machine and corruption. The machines didn't care about the city being a nice place to live. The machines cared about making money for themselves. So the objective of the progressives was to clean it up, make it a nice, livable place. And they did what I've kind of already told you. They decided to turn to scientific expertise. They decided to use business models of efficiency. You know, for them, that was the way you do this. You do this in the way it should be done. And what they do is they come up with a methodology that we still use today, absolutely, and it really does make for a better city. They began to use what they called city managers. The city manager was one of the great reforms the progressives did. Has anyone ever heard of the city manager as a position in the cities? You've heard of it before? Can anyone tell me a city that has a city manager? Pardon me? I think they do. I'm not sure because they're so big.
I think San Diego used to, and then they went to Strong Mirror, right?
I think they still do.
They still have a city manager?
I'm pretty sure they do. Pardon me?
I think Riverside does as well.
It does, absolutely. So the way I can ask this question is, what city are we in right now? We're in San Marcos.
This is all.
Oh man, we've got some geography issues in our class. Maybe that was too hard of a question. Sorry about that. San Marcos has a city manager. Escondido has a city manager. Oceanside has a city manager. Carlsbad has a city manager. Murrieta has one. Temecula has one. Riverside has one. San Bernardino has one. Moreno Valley has one. Menifee has one. They all have them, okay? It becomes the way we do things really in America, to be honest with you. City managers are not elected. They are appointed officials. They're appointed, okay? They are almost always the most highly paid employee of the city. And they are usually graduates, and even graduates. They come from graduate programs in urban planning or other things like that. I don't know if you guys know, but these guys get anywhere from $250,000 to over $400,000 a year because they have a really important job. And their job was simply to run the city to make it a nice, neat, efficient place. And they were in charge of such things as the streets, the sewers, the lighting, the parks, anything that makes the city a livable place. That is their job, to guarantee that this works the way that it should work, okay? And they began this process of employing the city managers, and I have to tell you, it is really successful. One thing that I want you to just be aware of as we go, we live under what they call the aegis of the progressive era. It's like an umbrella that covers us, all right? So many things that they did in the progressive era, they still influence our lives today, and city managers are a powerful component of that, all right? They're simply individuals who are experts in running a city, whose job is to make sure that is a nice, livable place. I know that our cities aren't perfect, but you have to understand that our cities are so much better than so many places around the entire world, of course, but also the cities of the Gilded Age. All the cities I live in, they have their bad little issues and their problems and their problematic locations, but generally speaking, they are pretty livable places. Okay, there's very few cities in Southern California that I would absolutely not want to live in, right? Because they're all going to be relatively okay. Anyway, city manager was a way of really cleaning up the city. The largest cities didn't go this way. I have to tell you this part of the story. So they created what they called the city commission. The notion was that the big cities were just too big for one person. So they created a series of commissioners, and the commissioners were all to subdivide the issues of the city and take control of their particular part. So there'd be a commissioner of streets, there'd be a commissioner of power and water, there would be a commissioner of sanitation, there would be a commissioner of parks and recreation. Her name was Leslie Knope, in case you weren't aware of that particular thing. And of course, who's the guy who sends out the bat signal? Don't be like yesterday. Someone said Batman. Boy, you made a mistake. So Batman is sending out the bat signal. It's Commissioner Gordon, right? It's the Commissioner of Police. And each one was an expert in their field, right? Each one was educated to deal with their particular issues. And as a group, they ran the city as efficiently as they could. They often worked independently in their own areas, but whenever there was a major city issue, they could all come together to unify their expertise to and remember, none of them are elected. They're all appointed. So they're all working for the mayor and, of course, for the city council, whatever it is. But it's their job to guarantee that the city is run in a nice, neat, and efficient manner. And generally speaking, they were very successful. Our cities in America, I've been to a whole bunch of them, are generally nice places to live. Of course, there's all kinds of issues and problems and location, whatever, but generally they're not too bad. Okay? And this is the result of what the progressives did. The second thing that the progressives began to do in the cities was to clean up politics. And of course, a particular target that they had was, what are they trying to get rid of? They're trying to get rid of the urban political machine. And I got to tell you, this was a difficult thing to do. And indeed, in some cases, they failed. The machines were not totally gotten rid of. But the machines had to clean up their acts. They became more of a legitimate political organization than the illegitimate political organization. So really, this does work also, right? Now, if you remember what I told you, the foundation of the power of the machine was voter fraud. They manipulated the vote in a way that would allow them to be empowered so they could use the rest of their time to make all the money they could, right? So the progressives were dedicated to the proposition of getting rid of voter fraud in America, and they will really do a very good job. The kind of things that they'll do, and this, again, is something that impacts us even to this day, is to demand voter registration. Voter registration. Voter registration creates voting as a legal act, and it defines you as the voter, defines you by residence and all kinds and location of polling, et cetera, and pretty much makes it so it's impossible for you to vote anywhere else or more than one time, all right? It's not absolutely impossible, but it's generally impossible to do anything like that, all right? Because voter registration. There was a moment there where I was duly registered because I had just moved, and so I suppose I could have tried to squeeze in 2 votes on that election, but I didn't do that because I didn't even want to do that kind of thing. And of course, we've heard of dual registrations across states and stuff like that, and that may be something of an issue, but I think it's a minimalist issue if it is anything at all. Anyway, voter registration. And you understand the bad side? You must be registered to vote, right? So it's also a disenfranchising thing for those that are not registered. That becomes problematic. And often to be registered, you must have a residence. So if you do not have a residence, if you're homeless, then you also could be disenfranchised. But in reality, the progressives didn't really care about that. They wanted good, solid citizens to be the voters, of course. They wanted to guarantee that that vote was a legitimate vote. Another thing they did that was super simple but super powerful. In the machine, you voted in saloons and taverns, and they made voting a party. They made it a party. So you're going to go there, and you're going to drink and eat, and you're going to get paid to vote and all this kind of fun stuff, okay? Well, the middle-class reformers said that is not the way. Voting is a serious activity. So they're going to move the polling place. It's a simple thing. You move the polling place and by moving the polling place, you clean up politics. So help me out. Where do we vote these days?
Down the street.
Okay, you vote down the street, but can you be more specific? Is it someone's house?
Mm-hmm.
So the houses of respectable members of the community. Where else?
For me, it's in elementary school.
I voted in schools many times. Anyone else, other places that you may have voted?
Churches.
I voted in churches many times, okay? These are essentially what we call uncorruptible locations, right? I have voted in a variety of different places across my entire life, and I have never had anyone try to corrupt me at all. And to be honest with you, I'm kind of pissed. I want at least someone to at least try to corrupt me. You know, it makes you mad when you've never even had the experience, you know, or anything like that. Anyway, but these are kind of uncorruptible locations. And simply by moving the polling place, I mean, you just change the dynamic, right, and the tenor, and the flavor of voting in many ways, and that was very effective. But the thing they did that is the most important reform of all the things they'll do, and maybe you can guess it, tell me something about the way we vote. It's really important. The way we vote, the action of voting.
Private?
Okay, it's private is fine, but it's secret. That's the word that we say. They called it the secret ballot. Up until the progressive era, voting was a public event in every way you could think of, right? Remember I told you they voted by ticket. So you walk into the polling place and you pick up a ticket in front of everybody, and everyone can see what ticket it is. They color-coded the tickets, and you drop it in the ballot box. Well, that allows people to know how you are voting, right? And it creates an environment for the potential of corruption and intimidation. I have to tell you, when I think of it, I think of the intimidation factor. I may have mentioned to you guys that Freedmen would pick up the Republican ballot and try to drop it in. There was a story of a white man putting a gun to a Freedman's head as he's about to drop that ballot. I mean, that's intimidation, like it's going out of style. You know, they're going to blow your brains out if you drop the Republican ballot in. Anyway, public voting has the problem that, of course, there can be the suggestion of intimidation and corruption. Well, the way you get rid of that is you vote in secret, right? Nobody knows what you're voting. Could you still try to corrupt a voter with a secret ballot? Could I stand out outside of the ballot, you know, the polling place, and say, I'll give you $20 to vote for me? Could I? I could, okay. But you all know that I can't guarantee what you're going to, you know, will you please vote for me? I'll give you $20. You say yes, and you take my 20. You know, maybe I won't give it until you come out. Did you vote for me? I did. You know. And I got to tell you, the machines were not dumb. You know, they're not going to pay you unless they know how you voted. They would only give them that $5 after they voted. Okay, here's your $5. The second that they cannot guarantee that you will vote the way they want to, they're not going to pay anymore. They can't do that. So the secret ballot was in many ways the death of that level of voter corruption. No one's going to pay for votes anymore. As I told you, I've been waiting for someone for me to pay me, and no one has done it. I'm kind of pissed off about the whole thing. Anyway, the secret ballot was designed in its original intention, of course, to get rid of intimidation and corruption, which it did, all right? But I must tell you that I am very appreciative of the secret ballot for one other particular reason, and that is that no one knows how I am voting when I'm voting, because there have been times when I have voted in a very unintelligent way. And I didn't want to do that, but I've done it. I don't know if you guys have ever done this before, but you go in to vote, of course, and you simply haven't done the prep or anything like that, and you get to the candidates and you just don't know who they are, okay? And I have to just tell you, this is a cautionary tale. I'm trying to get you guys not to do this, all right? This is something I did. Probably in the late 1980s I did this, and it's really sad that I did it. But I went to vote in a primary, and I was looking at the candidates for House of Representatives, and I didn't know one of them. Had no clue about any one of them, okay? But I thought that I should still vote. So what they had was their name and their occupation. So I was basically going on the name and the occupation. And so there was a woman, and it said housewife. And she was the only woman on the list and the only housewife. And I basically thought, you know, there's just not enough women housewives in Congress, essentially, so I'm going to vote for her. Well, I think it was 2 days later, and I find out that this woman was a follower of Lyndon LaRouche. And you guys have not heard that name before, but Lyndon LaRouche was essentially an American Nazi. So I voted Nazi that time, okay? And I could not believe, I was like, oh my God, I voted Nazi. Now the bad news is I voted Nazi. The good news, I did it in secret. So no one knows except for you, and oh God, I just told a whole bunch of people. But I'm telling you because I really want you to know that. I mean, do not do that, right? That's ridiculously stupid, and I've never done it again. Once I realized that if I don't know, I don't vote, you know. But really, what I would try to do is know. That's the more important thing, to try to know. I don't know if you guys do it like me, but I actually vote at home nowadays. I've just decided the absentee ballot is just so much more intelligent. It comes to you. You can sit around doing it as you want to. Oftentimes, my family gathers. We do it by committee. You know, how do we feel about this? How do we feel? We're reading the little pamphlet. A lot of times, we still disagree. I love that part. she'll say, my wife will say, well, I'm going to vote this way. Me too. I want to try to keep the peace in the family. Oh my God, you guys know 2 of my incredible secrets right now. I'm a Nazi and that I don't tell my wife the truth all the time. And don't worry, no one else knows except for all the people watching the video, but I think it'll be fun. Who's going to watch a history video for crying out loud? Come on. Secret's safe with everybody.
Tomorrow it's viral.
Hope not. Here we go. Okay, talking about the secret ballot, right? So I do think that is important, but really it's all about intimidation. And what's most important, of course, is they really clean up politics with the secret ballot. They're going to extend the secret ballot to the state level. And I don't know if you guys know, but all voting is local. Voting is not a national event, so the national government does not determine the nature of voting. So when the states and the cities decided on the secret ballot, that became the way it worked. Okay, everyone's going to have a secret ballot. The last thing I want you to tell you that the cities did was they began to venture into the realm of social welfare. So they're trying to help people who need help in one way or the other. The kind of things they did were they built, I already told you this one, but they built playgrounds for children. This was something that they thought would just be a really good thing to assist the well-being of children. So you see them beginning to build playgrounds. I must tell you that I'm kind of disturbed by the dynamics of playgrounds in our contemporary society. They've become these really safe zones, which I'm just not sure that that's good for anybody, to be honest with you. When I was a kid, playgrounds were really dangerous, okay? And it kind of taught us survival skills and stuff like that. We had merry-go-rounds, and of course, our notion of the merry-go-round, 2 results you want on that. One is to go so fast that you make the people on board puke. If you did that, that's success. And the other one was to go so fast that they simply flew off the thing. And I remember, the bad thing was we would go back and do this at the elementary school when we were like in high school. And we could really get that thing rocking and rolling. And I remember holding on for dear life one time. I don't know if I could. Centrifugal force pulling me. I love the teeter-totter. These were the big metal things, like heavy-duty steel stuff. You can imagine that thing just coming down on someone and killing them or whatever. But the objective was to get your friend as high as you possibly could, and then just step off and dump them. Bam! Come down, break their tailbone or something like that. I always thought it was so funny. You'd have them up there, just stared at them. They're going, don't. I wouldn't do that to you. The only thing is you had to be really careful about stepping back, because that could come up and do some damage to you too. And of course, the swings. The objective of the swinging was to. We all dreamt of making the loop. I mean, that was the thing. Can we loop this loop? I don't know. Let's try. You guys all know you can't, right? You're gonna crash, come down. But then the secondary objective was to get it as high as you could and then just go out into space. I swear, I'm pretty sure I was as high as the bar a couple times. That's pretty high, those things. And we would just let out. You're just like, oh, bye, good. I'm out here. It's taking a while to come down. Our notion was if you did not go home with something broken, you were not doing your job, And the other side of the equation is you went home with something broken and you got a spanking for it, They're not going to blame the school. They're going to blame the kid for doing that kind of thing. It was a much better time. Now it's all like padded this and padded that. Come on, you guys, let's have some fun here. Anyway, but regardless of all of that, they began to build playgrounds, of course. I told you about the free milk program to make sure the poor kids had something on their stomachs, of course, when they went to school. Just little things like that. Bigger things were factory safety laws. They wanted a better, safer place, of course, for the workers when they went to the factory. A huge issue for many of the progressives were child labor laws. Give you some of the facts about child labor just a little bit later, but a lot of kids are in the factories this time, and of course they thought that was bad. They need to be out playing in the playground, going to school, something else other than being in the factory. Now, when the cities tried to do this,
was school public education for children at that time? Or
yeah, there's a lot of public education. Remember I told you that began really with the horseman way back in antebellum Massachusetts with the reform, so you see it beginning to spread from that point. So that actually are public schools in this time. The issue is that there was no compulsion to go to school, though. That's going to come a little bit later. I'll have to tell you about that. Anyway, here's the thing. When the cities tried to do the factory safety laws and the child labor laws, they ran up against the wall of the corporate power. You guys all know that to make a company change its safety system, right, for better lighting, ventilation, or exposure to machinery, that's a capital expense. That's a big capital expense, of course. And companies don't like to be told what to do in this regard. And remember that child labor served the company. The company wants those little kids. They are small, they are agile, they are cheap, they do everything the company wants. So if you start to mess with the companies, they're not going to be happy about this kind of thing. And so they became very unhappy with what the progressives were trying to do. And they began to fight back, and they could fight back very effectively. A city is only as powerful as its area, right? The incorporated area. So if you have a factory right there, and you begin to regulate that factory, and they don't like it, all they have to do is move right there, right? Move outside the city limit and you have no control over them whatsoever. But that didn't even really have to happen. These companies would simply say to the city, you know, if you mess with us, we're going to leave. We're going to take our jobs, we're going to take our taxes, we're just going to run from here, okay? And of course the cities began to realize we can't deal with these guys. They're bigger than we are, they're more powerful than we are. So what happened was when they ran into that wall, they decided we need to go to a higher level of government to do what we want to do. And so that meant that they began to progress themselves to the level of the state. So we see the states beginning to mobilize. And of course, what do they have to do to take over the state? Got to get elected. So we begin to see all these progressive candidates who start running for governor. And some of them became very famous in American history. Woodrow Wilson was the great progressive governor of New Jersey. Hiram Johnson, you may not have heard of him before, he was the great progressive governor of the state of California. And one of the most famous was Bob La Follette. He was the famous Battling Bob La Follette of Wisconsin. And he, the governor who made quite a name for himself. I must tell you that this is like one of the few moments in American history where Wisconsin becomes like a central component of the story. When you do this kind of thing, I'm doing these history surveys, of course, you know, there are certain states that you have to talk about, right? They're just part of the story. So New York, Massachusetts, Virginia, all the southern states, California, Texas, Ohio, Illinois, you know, there's a number of them that are going to come up. But certain states, like, they never come up very much. So Delaware.
Idaho.
Idaho actually is going to come up here in a second, but, you know, Delaware. Part of me wonders, is there really a state called Delaware? And if it is, where is it? You know, I actually do know. I've been to Delaware before. I don't know if you guys know, but Delaware is like the holy grail of license plates because there's. If you ever do those traveling across the country and you're looking, you know, well, all the license plates you can get, it's just something to do. I've done it many, many times. It's kind of fun though. But if you see Delaware, you're like, oh my God, Delaware! The other day, what did I see? I saw New Hampshire and Vermont. In the same, I'm going, holy smoke, what the, and you know, I was so entranced, I like followed behind them, they're probably creeped, who's this dude, what's he doing? I'm just loving your license plate, dude, it's really cool. Anyway, but one of the states that does not come up too often is Wisconsin. And the only reason I'm making a big deal about this is because my cousins were from Wisconsin, and so, you know, I have to make a little bit of fun of Wisconsin here. When we were kids, I don't know if you guys had cousins from other places, but we get together and we do this kind of case on states thing, like who comes from the best state. So I had cousins from Wisconsin, I had cousins from Idaho, and of course I'm living in California. And you probably know that I could just defeat them if anything was really important. So what do my cousins from Wisconsin brag about? Cheese. They bragged about cheese. And I'm like, really, cheese? Come on. I don't know if you guys know, but California produces more and better cheese than Wisconsin. I'm just letting you know, okay? Let's get real here for a second, all right? But it would always crack me up. I'd go to Wisconsin, and they would take us to the cheese factory, and I'm like, really? Okay, you have cheese. And cheese factories often smell really bad. They smell kind of like crap. You know, it's the Limburger cheese kind of thing that's going on or something. Anyway, but you know, the other thing they bragged about was the Packers, and I had to give them that. I kind of think the Packers are pretty cool, right? And my cousins from Idaho, what would they brag about? They bragged about potatoes, and I'd be like, okay, potatoes. Come on, we got to come up with something better than that. So I was from California, of course, Southern California specifically. I only had to say one word, and I would absolutely defeat them. So what would a kid say that's from Southern California?
Beach. No winter.
Not the beach. I have a whole bunch, but I'm not going to. Go to the best. What do we have in Southern California that nobody else would love? That
Disneyland.
We had Disneyland. Okay. So all they had to say was Disneyland, and they would all be like down on the knees. We are not worthy, and I'd be saying, you are not worthy. You know. I have to tell you this last thing about Wisconsin. We would go to Wisconsin. I loved Wisconsin, to be honest with you. My aunt and uncle were really cool. I loved my aunt, loved my uncle. Uncle was a doctor. They were fairly wealthy people. Owned a house on the bottom of Fond du Lac. It's in Fond du Lac, which is the bottom of the lake, but right on Lake Winnebago. Had sailing boats, and we got to go water. I mean, I loved going there. That place was incredible. But I was there in 1968, so I was 11 years old, and like any 11-year-old boy, I was like endlessly hungry. So I would be bugging my aunt for food all the time. I just couldn't help myself. So this must have been like, 5 minutes after lunch on like the 5th day that we were there, and I'm asking my aunt what's for dinner. And apparently I'd done it too many times, and I pushed her a little too far, so she just kind of turned on me, sort of mad. Well, what do you want? She kind of pissed off at me. And I said, tacos. In that moment, Chris Johnson introduced the taco to Wisconsin. Thank you very much. That was me, okay? I must tell you that next time I went back, I said enchiladas. So I've done a lot for Wisconsin. I want to believe that story, but then we went, my aunt's like, tacos? She didn't even have a clue. We did go to the store and find tortillas, so I'm guessing that I didn't introduce the but anyway, I always want to believe that I was the person that introduced the taco to. I mean, they got the cheese, might as well have a taco. Good times for everyone. Anyway, Wisconsin became a leading reform state along with California, New York, and some of the others. And of course, these were the areas that began to really promote progressive reform. As they moved to the state level, something really important happens in terms of just government in America. In fact, we would call this a revolution in the nature of government. It's occurring in the progressive era. I don't know if you guys remember, but I told you that the governments primarily function under the concept of laissez-faire. You guys remember that? So what does laissez-faire mean?
Hands off.
Hands off, leave it alone. Okay, so the notion was the government should let everything pretty much go. Don't mess with the economy, don't mess with people, don't mess with the individual. Laissez-faire, leave it alone. Well, laissez-faire is not necessarily a bad idea. I'm not going to say that I absolutely think it's a bad idea, but it has certain requirements. And that is that laissez-faire works best when it's an equal playing field, when every single person that is functioning in that arena is equal. So for instance, one area where I absolutely believe in laissez-faire is like in sports, because I think that that's a legitimate situation. It should be hands off, leave it alone, right? And I just hate watching games, especially basketball, where they keep calling foul after foul. The reality is there is a foul all the time. If you guys watch football and watch any replay, you see that there's holding on every single play. I mean, that's just the nature of the game, all right? And if you call every single time, though, you start to go, oh my God, this isn't a game. It's a bunch of penalties or a bunch of foul shots or something like that. So there's a part of me that always thinks, laissez-faire, man. Unless it's egregious, don't call the damn thing. Let them play the game, right? Because they're equal out there. It'll work itself all out. So sometimes laissez-faire is okay. But it has to be an equal playing field, all right? By the time we get to America in 1900, it's not an equal playing field. And you guys know that we do not live under an equal playing field. There is now corporate America, and corporate America is so incredibly powerful. What power do I have next to Exxon? I have no power relative to Exxon, okay? And so the notion of the progressives was it just doesn't work anymore. It's not fair anymore. So their idea was someone has to make it fair. And who can make it fair? The government can make it fair. So they're going to eliminate the concept of laissez-faire and introduce what we call the interventionist or regulatory state. Regulatory. We are in an interesting moment in time, and I've been talking about this for a long time in my classes. But you know that right now we have a current administration who is very hostile to regulation. So he's going to go kind of on a deregulation sort of trip right here. And I love this. This is my sarcastic love, by the way, English, not getting it. He just simply says, like, for every new one, we have to eliminate two. Like, that's a meaningful process. What if the two are really powerful or important? I don't quite get those kind of things. But I do understand that we seem like we are over-regulated at times. And over-regulation does seem like it can dampen the kind of entrepreneurial spirit and, innovation and creativity, et cetera. And my notion absolutely is that we need capitalism, free enterprise capitalism, and we need to allow it to be free, and we need to allow it to be innovative and creative. But if you allow capitalism to go on its own merry route, I'll tell you, it'll damage you. It will damage somebody, okay? Capitalism has no humanitarian, ethical, or moral foundation to it. It's dependent upon the ethics, morality of the individual capitalist. And if that capitalist has no ethics or no morality, he'll screw you. He doesn't give a damn. All capitalism cares about is making money, and that's great, because it makes money like it's going out of style. But if you allow it to go unhindered, it can do damage. If you don't believe me, I've seen it so much in my lifetime. I mean, the tobacco industry, unhindered. What does it? It doesn't have to have any limitation. It just advertised cigarettes all over the place, of course. And even though they knew it could kill people, they wouldn't tell it. They wouldn't admit it. Of course, they would deny it in front of Congress and everybody else. And the government went along with it because they're a major employer and tax source. And that's the way it is. And supersizing companies and the various things they have done that will damage us one way or the other. So I believe we need some level of intervention and some level of regulation. The question is, what is the balance? What's the proper balance? That's the thing I think we struggle with. We have to find something that regulates, stops the most egregious and aggressive kind of damage that can be done, but allows for a significant level of innovation and creativity and free enterprise. I don't know that we've ever. It's hard to get to that perfect point. Anyway, this is the beginning of the moment of regulation and the beginning of the moment of intervention. I do want you to know that I believe in the beginning it was absolutely well-intended. They saw themselves as trying to make things fair. They saw themselves as offering protections to the citizen, to the worker, to the consumer. These are all really important things because I'm all of those things, right? And I want certain protections. You guys know that unhindered capitalism could mean that they will sell us a product that could actually kill us. You know, they were selling us for a long time saturated fat. We didn't even know it was in there or that it was bad. Neither one did we know. Okay, I want someone to tell me that saturated fat is not good for you, and you should not be eating that kind of stuff, and it should not be in the product. That's not a bad regulation, right? To keep something that could really do damage to our bodies or something. Okay, you know. Anyway, it was well intended in the beginning. What it becomes ultimately, that could be something different. Can it be overwrought? Absolutely, okay? Has it gone too far? Perhaps in some particular areas, no doubt about that, okay? So, you know, just understand it was well intended in the beginning, and they were trying to make things fair and trying to make it a better place for Americans in the beginning. But, you know, what I'm telling you right now is, I told you this, the rise of big business story, right? This is the story of the rise of big government. Government is going to get big. From this point on, it's going to get bigger, more involved, and more active in a whole bunch of ways. But it all begins with the states, and it all begins in the progressive era. Now, ironically, the story I'm about to tell you is not so much a regulation intervention with the states, but the states actually were concerned that they were empowering themselves to a very significant degree. And in America, we've always had this issue of we believe in liberty, primary value, and we're afraid of power, especially political power. And the power can be corruptive and damaging. So as they increased the power of government, they also wanted to increase the power of the people. So lots of the reforms that we see coming from the state are, I call them political reforms. And they're small d democratic. They're trying to increase the democracy. Am I on the screen here? Sort of, but I don't know if you can see this stuff. So these are like democratic reforms. If you're going to increase the power of the government, you should also increase the power of the people. They're trying to do both things at the very same time. And really what becomes the kind of hallmark of progressivism are the democratic reforms that they institute. So let me just give you some of them that they tried to do. They actually do. Walk away, please. I'm walking away. Okay. Here we go. One of the things they did was what we call the direct primary. I hate when I find things funny. It's really bad. Okay, direct primary. Does anyone know what we do when we have a primary? What we are doing when we have a primary? You've heard of a primary before, I hope. You've participated in one maybe. In a primary, we are electing
Choices.
Okay, we're having choices, but what are we electing specifically?
President.
Not in the primary.
Well,
It's
the players
political
are
party.
Okay, we call them the candidates, right? So we are choosing the candidates. Primaries allow us to choose the candidates who will run for the actual office itself. In the good old days, and remember that the good old days are often not so good, right? The party just simply presented somebody. The Republicans would say, here's Joe, you got to vote for him. And the Democrats would say, here's Fred, you got to vote for him. Now you and I, as Democrats or Republicans, we get to choose who we think should be the candidate, right? So we go through the primary process to identify that person which we think would be the best candidate. So it's giving us a little more say in actually who potentially could be in that particular office. So this was something they saw as a democratic reform course and that they instituted. Here's another one they did. It's called the direct election of senators. In the original constitutional agreement, the notion was that the House of Representatives would represent the people. So if you guys know how it works, the House of Representatives is based on population. The more people you have, the more representatives you have. And the Senate would represent the states. And they meant that literally in the very beginning, that the Senate was the representative of the states. So the way the senators were chosen was by the state legislature. People didn't get to vote for senators at all. The state legislature, you vote for the state legislature, and the state legislature would vote for the Senate. Well, the progressives began to say, why can't we vote for the Senate? Well, why shouldn't it be directly elected by the people? And they began to promote this idea on the state level. It actually becomes then a constitutional amendment, the 17th Amendment, on the national level, and it is the law of the land. So you and I get to vote for or against Dianne Feinstein, or for or against Kamala Harris. Kamala? I think it's Kamala. I always have a little bit of a hard time with that name. Kamala Harris. Anyway, so that becomes another reform that they instituted. Here was a big one that they did that really does potentially have an interesting democratic impact. It was called the Initiative, Referendum, and Recall. I'm kind of hoping someone knows something about this because it's part of that worksheet I had you guys do. So can anyone tell me what the initiative is? And it's technically the individual initiative. It is functional in the state of California and many other states. What do we have? What special power do we have here in the state of California? Yes, you. Good answer. That's exactly right. They'll never know, right? Okay, here we go. The initiative, you guys haven't heard of this before. You and I have the right to make a law in the state of California, which I think is pretty darn cool. You know, so if we really wanted to, we could make a law in the state of California. Any individual or any group could do this. And just to show you the process, you know, here's my fantasy law if I could make it. I've always wanted to ride my bike just about anywhere in California, but also have big times where I wouldn't be threatened by vehicles in any kind of way. So I would make a law where on Thursdays there will be no driving cars in the state of California, okay? And the roads will only be open to pedestrians and maybe horseback riders, but most importantly, of course, cyclists, right? Now, to make that law happen, what I would have to do is, of course, have it all written out in the ways that would fit the Constitution, so I had to hire a lawyer to put that together. I would then have to get a petition signed, of course, and I'd have to have people all over the state of California. I have no idea how many of them. I'm going to say like 500,000 people have to sign the petition. And if I got enough of them to sign the petition, it would be on the ballot. And of course, it appears on the ballot as you guys know what they are on the ballot? Pardon me?
Proposition.
Propositions. Yeah, they appear as a proposition, and we'd be whatever, of course. And if 51% of the people of the state of California voted for that, that would become the law of the land, okay? And we would call that the Chris Johnson Law. And every Thursday, we'd be out there on our bikes having a hell of a good time. But here's the thing, the only person I believe that would not be able to ride that day would be me, because you would all be so pissed at me that every time I ventured out, you'd be throwing stuff and sticking sticks in my spokes, you know, trying to trip me up and everything like that. I'd probably get killed out there relatively soon because you're all so pissed. But think how cool it would be and how much fun we would really have. And good for the environment too, and you exercise. Okay, never mind, I won't try to do it. Anyway, but this is something you could do in the state of California, and it sounds really benign, and in many ways it really is benign. But remember that anyone can do this, so a corporation could do this, an industry could do this. The one thing that I really don't like is that people from outside of the state of California can kind of do it. All they have to do is organize someone within the state of California to promote that initiative, and it can be part of the process too. I don't know how you're going to feel about me saying this, but I'm going to tell it to you because it's true. Proposition 8 was something that really was primarily funded from outside of the state of California by the Church of the Latter-day Saints and the Roman Catholic Church. That's the anti-gay marriage proposition, okay? So that to me is an external meddling in the affairs of the state of California. External meddling, yeah, it's true, in the state of our affairs. Okay, I don't like that. By the way, they put a ton of money into it, had a very effective campaign. It's kind of like, are you for families or for gay people? You know, that kind of division, like that's a meaningful kind of thing. Anyway, that's troubling. And remember that industry can do this all the time. So whenever you see like Friends of the Forest, you know that that's the lumber companies who want to chop down every damn tree. I mean, you can kind of lie in the initiative process too. So it's both good and it's bad, but it allows you and I to have this say, which is kind of remarkable. The referendum is simply a variation on the theme. That's when the state legislature refers it to us. And they usually do this when they don't want to take the responsibility for whatever it is. So, you know, should we spend more money on schools? Yes or no? Should we spend more money on prison? Yes or no? I must tell you that I do not mind that at all. I like to be asked those kind of things. Okay, I feel like as citizens of our state, we should be able to have some say in that kind of thing. So this is something that also becomes part of, and that's direct democracy, right? You and I get to say yes or no to the law itself. And then finally, the recall. You guys know this one?
To recall a president.
Don't say president because we don't have one in California.
Elected official.
Any elected official, we can recall them. We do not have to wait to the end of term. If we are so unhappy with them, we can yank them out of office. And understand this is complicated. You have to create the petition. You have to get the petitions signed. It has to get onto the ballot. It might be a special election. It's all tedious and expensive to some degree, but we can do that, right? And over the course of my lifetime, 2 major recalls in California history. We recalled Rose Bird, who was the Supreme Court Chief Justice. Apparently she was not killing enough people using the death penalty. And we recalled Gray Davis, of course, and replaced him with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So those are the 2 recalls that the big ones that I've had in my lifetime.
Is this, all states have it?
Not all states have it. Many states do, but not all. So New York has it, Wisconsin has it, California, and others that I can't remember necessarily. Many southern states do not have things like this. So, and you know, one thing that, whenever I say this, people say, yesterday someone said, does the federal government have anything like that? And of course it does not at all, right? They do not want to give up those kind of powers to us. The one that I think would work though is the referendum. There are times when I want the federal government to ask me what's going on. You know, I think that would be a really nice thing if they would do it. Now, of course, they cannot do recall, because if they did recall, presidents would be recalled every day of the month. You get that? There would be an endless, Obama would have been recalled every day, the current administration be recalled every day? I mean, that's what happens, right? Because there's enough people always to be unhappy with the situation to endlessly create a recall situation. The question becomes, you know, what would be the outcome of the election? I don't know that part of it, but they would want to recall them all the time. Anyway, so these things, you know, they're part of the kind of important reforms that the progressives did to allow the people more say in their governing apparatus. Save the best for last. That's a good notion of any presentation you guys would do. So here it is for you guys. By far, the most important reform of the progressive era was the recognition of the right to vote for really a technical majority of Americans. And these people had been systematically denied the right to vote since the beginning of the Republic, but now the progressives will begin to recognize that right. And what am I going to write on the board here?
Women.
They're going to recognize the right of women to vote. It's a really big deal. For reasons that I need to know, but I don't, I'm embarrassed to admit this. We call it women's suffrage, and I just don't get that word. Maybe I should, you know, you've probably heard that they called the women who advocated this suffragettes, you know, something like that. But, you know, I don't know exactly what they're saying, but it does mean the women's vote. And the progressives were the first to aggressively move in the direction of the recognition of the right of women to vote. I want you to think of it like that, because if I said they allowed, these are men, these men allowed them to vote, I don't like that one, okay? They should have been voting from the very beginning, you know, so all we're really doing is recognizing their right to vote, and that's finally happening in the progressive era. Now, the story's a little bigger than this, but I want you to be aware of it. Does anyone know the first state that recognized the right of women to vote? And I will give you a hint, it starts with a W.
Washington.
Well,
Wisconsin.
I always want you to say Wisconsin because I set you up by talking a lot about Wisconsin. But you said Washington, that's really good. But you are right, it was Wyoming. There's one other W state, you guys know what it is? West Virginia. Okay, so we actually have 4 W states. Anyway, I'm really an expert in those kind of things. How many C states do we have? 2? California, Colorado. What about As I said it, I'm thinking maybe I'm wrong. Connecticut doesn't count. Come on, who knows what that is? It's like Delaware. Who's ever heard of that? Are you sure that's a state? Did you just make that up? Anyway, Carolinas too, but I'm not going to go with that yet. Yes?
Suffrage comes from the Latin word for voting tablet.
Aha, so there we know. I'll forget it 5 minutes from now. Thank you very much for coming. Okay, Wyoming was the first. Wyoming did this when they became a state in 1879. And I always like to ask you this question. Why do you think Wyoming did this? And Wyoming doesn't seem to me to be real progressive or anything like that. But why would Wyoming be the first state to recognize the right of women to vote?
It's different there. It's technically the West. So the need to have that work.
Something happened to the men.
I haven't heard one of them that, I mean, there's others in the West too, though. California's as far west as it gets.
Something about their state required women to, or encouraged women to have.
Okay, I think the encouraging part of it is, can you guess a really practical reason why you might want women to have women voting?
Oh, because there's less people.
There's so few people. You guys know that the state of Wyoming has less people than the city of Riverside? I mean, that's weird, right? Riverside's got 300,000. I think they've got 275,000 or something like that. The biggest city is Cheyenne with about 65,000 people. So, you know, Escondido's a lot, double the size of Cheyenne. It's their state capital. So they have so few people. So what I'm thinking is, you know, they wanted to enhance the number of representatives, so they went from 1 to 2. It's kind of like that, though. Well, we could get 2. But I think your encouraging word is kind of more important here. They wanted women to come to the state to help for the population. So my notion is it's kind of like a pickup line, you know. Hey, baby, come to Wyoming. You can vote here. Okay? I mean, it's like we're trying to encourage you to come to Wyoming. I do have to tell you this, if you ever go to Wyoming in Cheyenne on the state capitol square, and it may not be there still, or I hope they didn't destroy it, I hope they moved it, but they had a big statue to honor that fact, and it was a statue of a pioneer woman, and she's sitting up there on the block, of course, and it's all bronze, really tall, like 12 feet tall, and her dress is blowing in the wind, because if you guys know that area, the wind is like always blowing across there. And she's standing there, of course, it says, Wyoming, first state to recognize the right of women to vote. I saw it the first time when I was just traveling through with my wife. Then we came back when my daughters were young. So I put Allie and Katie on both sides of that monument, and I had them put their fist up like this, okay? And, you know, I was trying to make a powerful comment, but they both had this really weird look on their face, like, Daddy, why are we doing, you know, I'm like, come on, you guys, get the right look. So similar situation, we're walking down the street in Washington, D.C., right by NOW headquarters, National Organization of Women, and I'm with my mom, my wife, and my sister. So I said, hey, you guys, I want to take your picture right next to the sign of NOW Organization. And as I did this, I said, give me the fist. And they did the same thing. They're like, give me this kind of... And so I said a little too loudly, does a man have to tell you how to make a power? You know, and right then these women are like, what? And they're just looking at me like, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill you right now. It was a bad time to make it. I was making a joke. I hope you guys know that. I was just joking with my parents and joking with my wife and everything like that. Almost got lynched by a bunch of angry feminists. Anyway, but damn it. Wyoming was the first to do this. What happens though, and by the way, the next ones to do it were also in that area, so it's like that group is kind of saying, okay, we're talking Utah and stuff like that. They're the first to move in this direction. But the progressives began to expand the notion outside of just the western area, the mountainous area, and we see New York beginning to recognize it, of course, all across the Northeast. California was the 6th state of the entire union to recognize the right of women to vote. They did this in 1911 by a 2% male voting majority. And I want you guys to know this was razor-thin majorities, right? The men have to decide whether they want the women to vote or not. And many, many men did not want that to happen. We'll tell you more about that conflict when we get to the national level, but you know, it's very close. The only area that uniformly said no was the South. The South will only allow women to vote when they are forced to do so by the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. But I have to perceive this as a distinct democratic reform, right? You are recognizing the right to vote of virtually half the population and bringing them into the equation in a very powerful kind of way. So this is a big deal as far as the progressives are concerned. Okay. Other things the states did, they don't just do political reforms, they also moved in the area of social welfare. I'm getting all jammed up in my board. There's kind of a redundancy to the activity, so I hope you forgive me. So you see that the states do child labor laws. You see the states doing factory safety laws. Some other things the states did that were new. They did the first ever Workers' Compensation Act. This was Maryland. Workers' comp, of course, is compensating workers who were either hurt on the job or lost their jobs, at least with a momentary entitlement or something like that. Oregon passed one that was called the Women's Labor Law. This one I'm intrigued by because it's both a reform but a problem. So the law said that women could not work more than 10 hours in a factory. And that was a reform, believe it or not, right? Cutting them down to 10 hours. I always love that part of it. But the part that bothers me, what they said in the legislation was that women are not strong enough to work more than 10 hours. And to me, it's so ludicrous because they are working more than 10. You're passing the law because they're working 12 and 14 hours. I mean, what are you saying they can't work more than 10 hours? This kind of stuff. I want you to know that the women did not protest. Okay, that's sexist, but it's okay with us. We're okay working with only 10 hours. But anyway, you get these kind of social welfare acts that are passed by the states. Finally, the states tried to regulate big business. These primarily appear in the form of antitrust legislation, but also in the form of regulations on railroads and other things like that. Usually what we call the natural monopolies, railroads, utilities, that kind of thing are the attempts to regulate. Now what happened to the state is exactly what happened to the city. As soon as they did this kind of stuff, they're messing with corporate power, right? They're messing with the corporate power. Corporations do not like to be told what to do in America, especially at this particular time. And so they did the exact same thing that they did to the cities. They said, if you mess with us, we'll leave. Or I have to tell you, they often simply left. They decided this is a bigger problem, we're going to leave. You guys probably know that California is it is maybe not the most. I think New York is pretty heavy, Massachusetts. One of the most regulated states in the entire union. We're a very heavily regulated state. And so, of course, those who have a particular perspective, they describe California as being unfriendly to business. And I will admit this, that California has a ton of regulations. It is a massive amount of paperwork that you have to do, of course, for businesses. There are sometimes issues that it does seem like it's overboard. So we have all these environmental restrictions. And if like a construction company accidentally has an oil leak that comes out of one of their big tractors or something like that, that becomes essentially a toxic waste situation. And they have to actually evacuate a huge area of dirt from, the spill might be that big, but you have to take away like a trailer-sized area of dirt to make that okay again. And those kind of things seem a little excessive, you know, at least dig out the part that was the oil, but why huge area, you know, because there's a potential of contamination or something like that. Anyway, because California is so regulated, many companies decide that they can't function here, right? They're going to move. Yes?
Hundreds of my personal friends that have owned small businesses, hundreds of them in the last 8 years no longer have businesses.
It's just,
hundreds.
it's tough. And
it's a small business.
It's hardest on the small business. I know that absolutely. The one thing that really bugs me, and I understand that bothers me, but that there are people who come into California from other states, like Rick Perry did this from Texas, right? And all they want to do is come in here and try to recruit our companies to leave California. And you know, they're more or less successful. Whenever I would hear that Rick Perry was doing that, he'd come in and like rent some place, a conference room in Anaheim or whatever, try to get the business to come tell them all the wonders of Texas. To me, that's like a violation of the sovereignty of the state of California. So I always hope that we would like arrest him for doing that, right? Take him into prison and put a brand on his butt, like Cali rules or something like that, just to let him know that you don't mess with California. They tell us about not messing with Texas. Well, guess what? You know, don't mess with us too. It's a wonderful idea. I'm sure you think that's a great idea, but no one, of course, is going to do anything like that. But we do lose companies, but still, we have the best and most important companies in America located in California. Most of them are willing to pay the price, you know, and it's bad. I mean, it's a problem. I don't quite know how to, that's that whole issue of balance that I was trying to tell you. But when Tesla put its battery company in Nevada, right, instead of California, it's a little bit of a betrayal. You know, their notion is the homeland is California, and then to put that big company in Sparks, Nevada, wherever they're going to do, I get it, though. They're going to get a lot of benefits from doing it in that particular area. But what happens, of course, today happened in those days. Here come the regulations. The heavily regulated state, the people wanted to leave. New York was heavily regulated, so lots of New York companies simply said, this is not good for us. And what they would do is they would move all the way from New York City across the East River to New Jersey. So they're in the same metropolitan area, but they no longer would be regulated. And New Jersey played on it, right? The New Jersey wanted them to come because it's tax for them, essentially. And so they would lessen their regulations to guarantee that they could take states and take the companies from other states. So the states found themselves again in trouble. They can't deal with the power of the corporate power, or the ability of the corporate power. So what do? The progressives decide we've got to go to the ultimate expression of government in the United States of America. They're going to move to the national government. And as they do this, of course, you know, they change the dynamic just a little bit here. They begin to elect progressives to the House of Representatives. They begin to elect progressives to the Senate, essentially. Madeline Bob LaFollette, the governor of Wisconsin, becomes the senator from Wisconsin to do as much as he possibly can in the national government. But the real story of the progressive era in the national level is the story of two presidents. You know, all of a sudden it's going to refocus kind of on two people who become the center of reform and the center of activity. As the century began, no one would have thought, you know, the individual who was president was not going to be a progressive. They kind of knew that. And the guy that was president in 1900 was a man by the name of William McKinley. And William McKinley was the last of the so-called Gilded Age presidents. And I have to tell you that, well, I don't know if you noticed, but I have not mentioned a president since Andrew Jackson. Have you noticed that at all?
Yes.
And there's a reason for that, right? Because they're not doing anything. That it's not important to understand who they are. They're the do-nothing presidents of the Gilded Age. And they're the kind of presidents, I always think of them as the historically lost presidents. So we have them on milk cartons, okay? Have you seen Chester A. Arthur? Does anyone know where he is or what he did? You know, these guys are just not really important to us because it's just a time of limited power for the executive and the Congress really being much more powerful and other things being generally much more important. But you'll notice that from this point on, you will know the names of every single president because the presidents are going to assert themselves, and they're going to assert themselves because of the progressive era. Well, William McKinley was a laissez-faire conservative Republican who really didn't believe the government should do anything in any significant kind of way. He's important in American history. I'll tell you much more about that later. In foreign policy, but in domestic policy, he was like, you know, don't do it. That's not what we're supposed to do. So that's the beginning of the progressive era, a president who doesn't believe you should do anything. But that's not going to last. Because in 1901, William McKinley tragically became the third president in the history of the United States to be assassinated. So he's the third that this will happen to. The first was Abraham Lincoln. The second was James Blaine. Didn't even mention him, of course, Gilded Age president. And the third is William McKinley. There's the story, not that you need to know it. There was this immigrant by the name of Leon Zolgos, and the main reason I don't want you to write that on the board because I have no idea how you spell his name. It's all a bunch of C's and Z's and stuff like that. But he came to America. He worked for the re-election campaign for William McKinley, And because he worked for the campaign and the president won re-election, he believed he deserved a job in the government. He somehow believed he deserved a job for what he did. So he wrote a series of letters, increasingly strident letters, to the president saying, you know, I helped you, you need to give me a job, this kind of thing. And McKinley never saw these letters. They simply came into a secretary who read them and said, this is a crazy guy, and threw them in the trash can, all right? Well, Zogos began to believe that he had been betrayed by McKinley. So he hunts him down at the railroad depot in Buffalo, New York. He catches up to him there, and he shoots him in the gut. He shoots 2 bullets into William McKinley. Now, if McKinley had been shot that way today, he would not have died. It was not that kind of a serious situation whatsoever. You guys know that Ronald Reagan was very serious when he got shot. I mean, that's right up against the lining of the heart and stuff. I mean, that's serious stuff, right? You've got a bullet next to the heart. You're going to have to deal with that. His wounds were nothing like that. These are internal organ issues, of course, but they could manage that relatively well, even in those days. But they botched it, you know, they did something wrong, and it led to infection, which led to sepsis, which led to death. You know, he would not have died today, I'm absolutely convinced of that, but he died in 1901 because they just didn't make it happen. And of course, so McKinley is no longer going to be the issue of that particular moment. You guys remember I told you about that death of a president thing? You know, sometimes when they die, it's not a big deal. Sometimes when they die, it's a tragedy, like the death of Lincoln. Sometimes you could argue it's actually good for America when a president dies. And I do not want to be mean to McKinley. It seems really cruel. You know, I feel sorry for him and his family and everything. But when he died, he opens the doors for a person who will become really one of the great presidents in American history. Now, that person was the youngest person ever to become president. Now, remember, this is a Trivial Pursuit issue, right? So who was the youngest person ever to be elected? That's the key word, right? Elected president. Who's that? It's John F. Kennedy. He was elected at 42 years and 11 months. Okay, so he's very young, right, for presidents, elected at 42 years and 11 months. But the youngest person ever to become president, in this case, because of the death of a president, of course, his name was? This is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, the youngest person ever to be president, 42 years and 3 months. So he's only months younger, but he's younger, right? And it's really a telling issue because when he comes to power, he's young, dynamic, forward-looking, progressive. I mean, it's a different show than it would have been under McKinley, and all of a sudden, of course, this is going to amp up the power of the progressive era in a major way. Just have a couple minutes. I just want to say a few things about Roosevelt. Interesting individual. He came from an old, distinguished family in New York, the Roosevelt family. The Roosevelts were descended from early settlers to New Amsterdam, so their lineage goes all the way back to the colonial period before the English even took it over and turned it into New York. It was a family of wealth and prestige, to say the least. 2 branches that will develop for this. I don't know if you guys are aware of this. The Sagamore Hill Roosevelts, that's the Teddy Roosevelt clan, and then the Hyde Park Roosevelts, that's the Franklin Roosevelt. And intriguingly, they hated each other, okay? And they were political opponents, the Sagamore Hill Republicans, Hyde Park Democrats. And when Franklin Roosevelt runs, this is later, of course, you know, the Sagamore Hill, the children of Teddy Roosevelt are his chief enemies. I mean, it's amazing to me that they are just endlessly going after their own fourth cousin or whatever it is that, you know, going on. But, you know, the 2 of them don't get along very well. But they had wealth, power, money, and of course he was born to do anything he wanted to. I mean, born into a family that was very wealthy. But he chose the kind of path of what he called the noblesse oblige, the noble obligation to serve his country in whatever way he possibly could. And pretty much that's what he's going to do. I love to tell you kind of the 2 sides of the story of their family. So he's Teddy, he's the older brother. He goes on to all the incredible things he did. His younger brother was Elliot. And this is what I always wonder, is this the younger brother, older brother thing? Or are they just 2 really different people? But here comes Teddy Roosevelt, all his heroic activities. Elliot goes on to a life of dissipation, drug abuse, alcoholism, madness, and dies very early. Okay, I mean, just totally different life in many ways. And the tragedy of that story is that he was the father of Eleanor Roosevelt. You guys know Eleanor Roosevelt, who goes on to marry Franklin Roosevelt. And my image of poor Eleanor, I mean, Eleanor's the saddest story you can imagine as a child. She's sitting there at the age of 6 years old waiting for Daddy to come home. Daddy never came home. Daddy's too drunk. Daddy's too high. Daddy's too wrapped up in prostitutes, you know. Daddy's running naked across the open field because he's gone wacko and delusional. And he's a sad, sad story. So his life just, rich people gone bad, you know. And then there's the other side, of course, of Teddy Roosevelt, rich people doing some really interesting and important things. The last thing about Roosevelt, I always like to tell you his resume before we get to, before he became president. And I want to compare this with my resume at the age of 42 years and 3 months, okay? So it's not very impressive, but it's impressive enough, what can I say? So here's what Chris Johnson had done in terms of occupation. By the time he was 42 years old, I worked on a Christmas tree farm. It was really exciting. You know, it's interesting because that meant that I killed probably 2,000 Christmas trees, but I want you to know that I planted 2,000 too. Every time I cut one down, I had to plant. It was also a citrus thing, and I love to drive tractor through the whole thing. I had a lot of fun there. I worked as a noon duty. I think I told you about that when I was trying to corrupt the youth, the morals of these youth. I became what do you call it, TA, of course, in graduate school. Then I became an adjunct teacher. Then I got my full-time position here at Palomar College, and that's pretty much all I've ever done, okay? So here's Teddy Roosevelt by 42. At the age of, I think, 21, he was the youngest person ever elected to the New York legislature. So he became, not just elected, but became a dynamic member of that legislature. He was a commissioner of police of New York City, so he moved on to being part of this commission kind of style of government. He was the undersecretary of the Navy under a secretary who did nothing, so he basically ran the Navy in his early 30s, it's pretty amazing. He became the governor of New York, of course, very powerful and very influential in terms of activity there. He then became the vice president of the United States, and then he became the president. Okay, so his resume, not quite as good as mine, but nothing to really, look down upon too much. He also was a best-selling author. Anyway, as he comes into the White House, young, dynamic, he brought a family of 6 children under the age of 16, which is really kind of interesting. It's like the first time there was really this kind of youthful dynamism, which Teddy Roosevelt, he really wanted. He wanted his kids to be crazy, and they were crazy. They were just amazing. His oldest daughter, Alice, and she's got an incredible story. She pretty much snuck out of the White House routinely, going out through the window to go smoke dope with her friends. Swear to God, it's not that far from what I'm telling you, okay? Go get high, get drunk or whatever. She was like an endless sort of problem for Teddy, but that's cool. That's what she should be doing. The other kids would bring live animals into the White House and let them go. They brought a goat one time and shoved it in the cabinet meeting just to make some fun. They also fired a small cannon inside the White House. Can you imagine doing that today? You fire the cannon off, and of course, here come the Secret Service, just Uzis blazing, Oh my God, it's the president's kids. Well, they fired a cannon. That's what happens. Anyway, young, dynamic, of course. The people fell in love with him. They're going to name their little stuffed bears after him. You guys know what those are called? Teddy bears. It's all Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, they love it. And anyway, he's going to do all this kind of really interesting stuff that I'm not going to tell you about for a long time. You're going to miss this stuff. When we come back, I hope you guys have, I got to turn this out before I say anything to you.